Bomberman Quest, a game that further disproves my initial understanding of the Game Boy Color being a system purely for bad movie tie-in games based off of already existing bad movies, and bad 2D renditions of already kinda bad 3D N64 PS1 games. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of them on this system, this just isn't one of them. Now the story follows Bomberman, now apparently some kind of weird legal space poacher who's captured a lot of monsters across the galaxy and is trying to return them to Planet Bomber for imprisonment. So, yeah, space poacher. But four mysterious things steal his ship's engines and he crashes on a nearby planet, which releases all the monsters, and now he has to go catch them all again. And by catch them, I mean murder them to death with his giant explosive-y death bombs. How that classifies as capture, well, that's anyone's guess. Also, this seal is trapped in ice and not hurting anyone, and you just want to blow him up? What the hell is wrong with you, Bomberman? The gameplay itself feels highly experimental. Instead of a standard top-down, sort of arcadey Bomberman type game, this is more of a top-down adventure game, which, being on the Game Boy Color, immediately means it's going to be compared to The Legend of Zelda, which was like the king of top-down adventure games on the system. But this game feels highly experimental in its design, trying to meld both classic Bomberman action with a top-down adventure. And what I mean by this is, unlike a standard adventure game, the core focus of gameplay here is to kill all the enemies, kinda like a classic Bomberman game. But unlike a standard adventure game or even a classic Bomberman game, all these fights take place one-on-one, and typically take place in large wide open areas. This initially might make you think that that makes combat really easy, but it's actually very tricky, especially early on, when you've got virtually nothing to your name. Because you are forced to figure out the timing on your explosives, and find a way to get your opponent to essentially walk into them. And I know that sounds kind of like other Bomberman games, but other Bomberman games had an element of strategy to it, where you could sandwich your opponent in between bombs and bits of the environment. In this game, you kinda can't do that because a lot of the areas are wide open fields. So you're kind of forced to just sort of plant a bomb and hope your opponent walks into it. I mean, and I'm gonna stress this again, but especially early on, it is really, really bad. Like, the first enemy you run into is programmed to essentially be attracted to your bombs, and getting to actually get hit by the explosions still feels like a complete and total crapshoot. It just feels like the way the enemies are programmed to react around your bombs doesn't really lend itself well to actually trying to get them killed. But the fortunate thing is, like most adventure games, you get new equipment as you move through the game, such as landmines, which are hidden to the enemy, but when stepped on will explode, provided they don't disappear within a certain amount of time, and they usually end up killing me in the process. Incidentally, that seems to be the easiest way to hurt anything in this game too, so yeah. But there's tons of other bits of equipment. Some of it drops from enemies, others you get from chests solving. I hesitate to even really call them puzzles, but you get them from solving puzzles, and the neat thing is there are various different bits of equipment. There are of course bombs, which allow you to attack your enemies, and certain bombs have different effects. In fact, there's like a whole bomb crafting system, which is kind of neat. But other bits of equipment, such as heavy shoes, get used in a couple different puzzles, such as weighing down switches, or preventing yourself from being blown away by wind. Unfortunately, that's about the end of the positives when it comes to equipment, because this game tends to take the Symphony of the Night approach to equipment, in that you use each piece of equipment 2 or 3 times, then you swap it for the next biggest thing and you never go back. But on the bright side, it also kind of works better in this game than, say, Symphony of the Night, because the game itself is actually very small, and it actually works quite well to have a quicker pace of equipment turnaround. Beyond that, the core focus of gameplay is to go hunt down the 4 dastardly bombers, or whatever their equivalent in this game was called, hidden within 4 very, very simple temples. Like, each one has maybe half a dozen rooms total, and like, maybe 2 puzzles. Yeah, did I mention this game was kinda small? Cause, yeah, it really is. So the gameplay itself feels sorta like they tried to half take an adventure game, half take a Bomberman game, slow it down to a crawl, and then kind of cobble it back together piece by piece, hoping it was sort of playable. And it's playable, but I'm not really sure it's all that enjoyable. The overall presentation in this game I felt was very lacking. Visually the game looks okay, but I find Bomberman looks really cramped, like they just crushed him down. And I get it that that's to fit him into like the 1x1 square grid system they have, but he just looks so weird. Like, I've got 3 of the 4 Bomberman Game Boy Color games, and I think this is like the worst looking of the entire bunch. That said, I like the individual portraits of the enemies. The fact that each enemy has a portrait is kind of an impressive thing. The soundtrack itself is largely not worth mentioning, like, at all. Seriously, there's nothing on this soundtrack that's particularly good to listen to or all that memorable, kind of rounding together an overall below average package. And that's Bomberman Quest. It's a game that, as I've said, feels highly experimental in nature, but I don't think they really pushed the concept of a Bomberman top-down adventure game all that far. It feels like they just scratched the surface from taking the aspects of both games and didn't really go with it. And by playing it safe like that, they end up ignoring what this game is actually supposed to be. It's not supposed to be an adventure game with arcade puzzle-like pacing. It's supposed to be a Bomberman adventure. You're supposed to run around, bomb enemies, fight bosses, save the world. And it's not like this idea hasn't been done before and shown to be done excellently. I mean, hell, there's literally every Bomberman on the N64, except Rainbow Palace in Bomberman 64. That level sucked, but aside from that, those games were all awesome. And the fact that I say this game is so experimental seems to be proven true because on the Game Boy Advance there is a game that is basically the sequel to this. I mean, it's not, but it feels largely like it is. And it's called, confusingly enough, Bomberman Tournament, which has nothing to do with tournament, but it's basically Bomberman Quest 2, the version you actually want to play. Now, do I recommend Bomberman Quest? At the price it typically goes for in North America, absolutely not. This game is actually pretty expensive for what you're getting, typically sitting at its lowest point at $30. And that's a lot for a game that doesn't give you all that much gameplay. And if you're the kind of person who is hung up on a short game, this one's not going to be for you because you can beat it in an hour. Now, if you don't mind importing a game, you can get the Japanese copy for about $5, and that's far more reasonable. I'm actually playing a PAL version, which costs about $10, and it has an English settings, and that's a less expensive way to get an English copy. Although confusingly enough, the box has its instructions in French, German, and Italian, but not English, and the game itself does not have the Italian language, which is a bit weird. Overall, Bomberman Quest is a bit of an oddity. It's trying to take Bomberman and put him on a handheld top-down adventure, and while I don't think it succeeded all that well in making an overall good game, it certainly is one of the more interesting handheld Bomberman outings.